Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christopher Riopel. I'm the Neil Westreich Curator of post-1800 paintings here at the National Gallery. And it has been my great pleasure and education to work with our colleagues at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and with our speaker this afternoon in the preparation of the exhibition that opened to the public this morning, Thomas Cole, Eden to Empire. It is an exhibition that was shown with great success at the Metropolitan in the earlier part of the year and has now come to us more or less in the same form as it was seen in New York. But of course, what is so fascinating is that the context is so different. As the American ambassador said at the opening the other night, every school child in America knows Thomas Cole, and so it was a kind of triumphant celebration of this great figure in some ways. We do not know him as well. We hope that this exhibition will do a very great deal to rectify this, and the person the guest curator of the exhibition, whom we will be hearing in a few minutes, is exactly the right person to talk to us about a British-born artist who has a huge impact on American art. Tim Barringer is from Yorkshire, yet very bravely he has taken on a Lancashire artist. Tim is the Paul Mellon Professor of the History of Art at Yale University. He's well known to us here in London for his wonderful work on various aspects of British art and of American art, and I think the two great exhibitions he's done for Tate, the American Sublime in 2002, and then 10 years later, the Pre-Raphaelites in 2012. He, in 2009, was the Slade Professor at Cambridge University, whence he graduated, lecturing there on art and music in Britain, Gothic revival to punk rock. Tim, as you will see, will be perfectly at home in both of those categories and everything in between. But he has devoted a great deal of attention and thought to Thomas Cole as the Brit who comes to America and then comes home. Briefly, to build up his arsenal to create American landscape painting, and it is on that aspect that he will talk to us today. Tim.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, and it's an absolute delight to be here at the National Gallery. I think the only person more pleased than me that this show would be here is Thomas Cole himself. If he's watching us on YouTube, he probably is, because Thomas Cole is a unique figure, really, in the sense that he is born in this country but is known as an American artist. And if you come to New York, if you've had the good luck and pleasure to visit the Metropolitan Museum, you'll see just what power Thomas Cole has. If you enter the American wing, two redoubtable ladies of the Golden Age frame this great vista through the galleries, and as you approach, it's like walking down the nave of a cathedral, and over the altarpiece of American art is this painting. We get closer and closer. It's the painting, The Oxbow, by Thomas Cole, painted in 1836. It's celebrated as a great icon of America itself. America, the wilderness, America, questions about progress and development, the wilderness on the left, the developing world of the United States on the right, and in the middle there, right here, Thomas Cole himself. There he is. Now, this painting has been celebrated in the United States. It was the key work for this great exhibition of 1986, American Paradise, which is a very decided view about the story that Cole was telling. And I'm going to offer you a different version of what Cole was saying today. And it's this painting which I desperately wanted to include in the exhibition at the Tate in 2002, American Sublime, which I curated with Andrew Wilton, the great scholar there. we were told that this painting does not leave the Metropolitan Museum because it's too much of an icon. However, you can actually see it here in the National Gallery today, thanks to the generosity of a later generation of curators, including my friend and colleague Elizabeth Kornhauser, with whom this present exhibition has been curated. So by bringing this great icon back to London, we set up, or really back to England, we set up a set of questions which might disturb a mythology which has grown up around Thomas Cole. And what we do in this exhibition is to present Thomas Cole as a much less settled figure, as a sort of transatlantic migrant. In fact, the American version of the show had the subtitle Atlantic Crossings, to give the sense of someone who is constantly on the move, who's never quite at home. Now, the painting that tells a different story is not by Cole at all. In fact, this painting was created after Cole's death. It's in our exhibition right at the end. So I'm starting at the end of the exhibition. I'm going to go back to the beginning, and then we'll end up at the end again. Because I wanted to share this with you. This is a piece of myth-making, really. It's a brilliant painting by Cole's friend, Asher Brown Durand, actually a slightly older man. Thomas Cole died at the age of 47 suddenly, and there was great bereavement in the United States that they'd lost their greatest landscape painter, perhaps their greatest painter of all. So Durand paints this memorial picture, and this is the Thomas Cole that every American schoolchild knows. Thomas Cole standing amid the landscape of the Hudson River Valley. Catskill Clove is the name of this. You can't actually get this view. These are lots of different bits of it all made up into a sort of ideal composition. Talking with his friend, the poet William Cullen Bryant, who we'll hear from again in a minute. It's a friendship portrait, but it's also a portrait about the founding of American landscape painting. The idea is this is the father. This is the father of American art with his sketch pad and his maul stick. And if we get closer, Bryant and Cole have actually carved their names into the bark of an American tree, as if they somehow belong under the surface of American nature. Of course, it's vandalism, which we don't approve of anymore, but there it is. And at his death, interestingly, Cole had been memorialized in the most modern technology, the daguerreotype photograph by Matthew Brady, New York photographer. And from that was made posthumously this great bust, this rather monumental classicizing bust. It's almost as if the American culture wanted to take the modern Cole and make him into a sort of monumental figure. What we do in this exhibition is something quite different. We take Thomas Cole, there he is, and we look, he's looking at us, incidentally, it's very interesting. He's staring us in the face, and I'll come back to that at the end, but we need to actually stare him in the face too, and ask, who are you, actually? And this is a very different landscape from the one I've just shown you. This is the landscape of the town in which Thomas Cole was born in February 1801, Bolton, Lancashire. I say it as a Yorkshireman, but I say it advisedly. This, I think, is the aspect of Cole's formation which has been quite deliberately forgotten in the making of an American master. But if we take this seriously, we find Cole a much more interesting and complex and ambivalent figure than if we simply take him as a heroic inventor of American landscape painting. So let's think about these industrial towns. When Cole was 15 years old, something pretty bad happened to him. He was brought up in a moderately well-off family. He went to a school where he learned Latin and poetry and music. And then at the age of about 14 or 15, his father effectively went bankrupt. Cole was taken out of school and sent onto the factory floor to work among the laborers creating blocks for printing calico textiles. Now that is a tremendous a change of circumstance for Cole. So he'd seen various sides of the Industrial Revolution. That very year, or about that year when that happened, another artist who's looms large in our story, J.M.W. Turner, was touring the north of England. He painted this, and as a Yorkshireman, I'm glad to say this is Leeds. He painted the Yorkshire city of Leeds. But I show you this watercolor, and we include it in the show, because it sets up a binary which runs right through Cole's life. The binary between the pollution and danger and ugliness, but also wealth and energy of the new industrial cities. This is Benjamin Gott's mill, the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, which sometimes flowed black with pollution. This is the world, a very similar world to the one in which Cole was born in Lancashire. And the one little fragment of autobiography we have is him telling a friend that he remembered climbing after a long day's work in the summer in these industrial circumstances up into the moors above Bolton, just like the moors above Leeds, the Bronte country up here, and feeling himself free in nature after this horrible experience of the violence of industrialization. Industrialization versus nature, the wilderness versus the corrupt activities of man. That is the theme of Thomas Cole's life. Turner, of course, a genius, is able to pick this out with a tiny watercolor brush and give us that contrast between filth and sort of glorious nature when we look at a work like this. Thomas Cole, we discovered, actually our research assistant discovered using Google, because that's how you do research now, that Thomas Cole was baptized in an independent chapel. So he comes into a world of extreme nonconformist Protestantism, hellfire and damnation. And we imagine the baby being carried out from his baptism, walking on the way home along Velvet Walk, because they made velvet textile there. And the first thing he sees after being baptized is something like this, the Albion Foundry. That's why we include this painting in the exhibition. 1801, Philippe Jacques de Loutherbourg sees this scene at Colebrookdale, but the very similar things were going on in Lancashire. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. In fact, Bolton was the core of the mechanization of the textile industry. So it had long been a textile town with skilled laborers doing spinning and weaving, and suddenly those skilled laborers were thrown out of work by this invention, Samuel Compton's mule, invented in Bolton. And Bolton becomes a hotbed of industrial unrest. This is all while Thomas Cole is a boy, between 10 and 15 years old in that town. It's in Bolton that the largest and most violent uprising comes from the Luddites. Ned Ludd, you will remember. It's a word we use now to describe not being able to use our iPhones properly, but the origins of it are actually Ned Ludd, the mythical leader of the machine breakers, the people who burned down the factories with machines, smashed them using Luddite mallets. I kind of wanted a Luddite mallet in the show, but the Met thought that was a little beyond the pale for a fine art exhibition. But here's Ned Ludd, and you can see he's bizarrely dressed in a woman's calico frock. And of course, the idea is that he's wearing the kind of clothes that are made in the factory here. Meanwhile, the police are after him, but the local people of Bolton are stopping him as if they sympathize with Ned Ludd, in fact. There's the calico dress. And here is the face of violence, the face of the damage that the Industrial Revolution can do. Now, the story I'm telling you in such detail is important because it contrasts with this narrative of the Hudson River School and beauty and landscape. But it explains why Cole thought the landscape was so important. It's a contrast. 1818, James Cole, the father, decides he can't make a living in England, and the whole family emigrate. Thomas is 17. They emigrate to Philadelphia. 5 years are spent in a sort of search for prosperity, which never quite comes right. The family moved to Philadelphia, they moved to Ohio, they're traveling around. Thomas, meanwhile, remembering his early education, still reading a lot of poetry, wants to become an artist, and he has the skills of an engraver. He apprentices himself to an engraver in Philadelphia, having already done a little bit of that work in Liverpool, in fact. This is the first work we have of Thomas Cole as an artist. 1823, From Nature. But he's looking at nature with the skills of an engraver, whose hand moves with these very fine parallel lines, an engraver with great skill. But he's much more than an engraver now. He's much more than a reproductive engraver. He's a person who sees in nature a strange force of life. This is a tiny drawing, but when you see it in the show, it has real animation. And this becomes the sort of core of Cole's work. You can see there are the engraver's lines. Look at the hatching there. The making of Thomas Cole is his decision in 1825 to move to New York City, which is suddenly becoming the most important economic city in America. Suddenly, Boston and Philadelphia, which had long been established as colonial important cities, are losing out to New York because New York is on the new canal, which has opened up the Hudson River and then the Erie Canal, opening up the Midwest and the trade with the great prairies and the cornfields down to this city, which is a harbor. And you can see here another English artist giving us a picture of what New York looked like, a man called Bennett, what New York looked like in 1825 when young Thomas Cole, absolutely penniless and learning to be an artist, sort of autodidact, trying to teach himself, comes to this town. And somehow or another, this young man, in 2 years from then, produces a work like this, which is an out-and-out masterpiece. So I do not in any way want to diminish the story of the extraordinary emergence of Cole from almost nothing to a fully fledged artist. And indeed, in a way, one of the reasons why this painting, The Sunrise on the Hudson Valley from 1827, is so striking is because he's never been told not to do this. If he'd been at the Royal Academy schools, if he'd been exposed to the work of Turner and Constable as a young man, he would have known that you're not allowed to have a great big black lump in the middle of your painting. But when he puts it there, with this contrast, with this extraordinary sunlit foreground, and then an absolute precipice, there's no middle ground. Foreground, nothing, background. He actually creates a work which is indelibly, I think, indelibly memorable. This is the landscape of the Hudson River. These, in fact, are the ships going up to the, all the way up to the Erie Canal up here in the north, down to New York City this way. So he is very much a part of that development. But he chooses not to show us the modern development of America, but to show us the wilderness, to show us the wild lands of America, and to show us the mystery of the mist which twists here around the side of this great mountain. Thomas Cole was extremely lucky to find patrons who were prepared to support him. They decided that he was an American genius, and they absolutely wrote out of history his English origins. So he was taken up by a man called Daniel Wadsworth, who founded the first art gallery in the United States, the Wadsworth Athenaeum. You can still visit it in Hartford, Connecticut. They lent us this painting by Cole, a very beautiful small work on panel, which shows Wadsworth's summer house, the Montevideo near Hartford, Connecticut. And you can see that Wadsworth has taken the American wilderness and has turned it into a kind of capability brown English country house, even with a Palladian boathouse and a Gothic villa. And also, I think Thomas Cole slightly fantasizes the sort of Jane Austen love interest in the foreground, because he was conspicuously single at this point. But he gives us a vision of the balance between the wild world of America and the world of civilization. And to me, this is Cole at his absolute happiest. This is Cole, really, when he has found a place for himself. Don't forget, in Bolton, he was down in the valley, climbing up into this world and then going back down to the factory. He's made it. He's made it socially. He's made it artistically. But he was more ambitious than just painting small, picturesque paintings. And Wadsworth encouraged him to create more ambitious works. As Cole said, I aspire to a higher style of landscape. Landscape which is going to become intellectual, which is going to address the great themes of biblical and historical landscape, which, of course, he knew from reading and from engravings that Turner was doing this in London, that Claude Lorraine had done it before. He knew it was there. He just had never seen these paintings, only in reproduction. This is a painting that he created as a first stage in that, and this is the beginning of our exhibition. It's the reason the show is called Eden to Empire. The Garden of Eden, 1828. An ambitious painting, a painting in which the Garden of Eden is a kind of American garden. Because if you look, first of all, we see Adam and Eve here, and I have to say that at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, the education officers told me that the school kids now say, why are they taking selfies? Which rather undermines the biblical grandeur of this picture. And, you know, we don't want to go down the line of naked selfies. That's really not what we talk about in the National Gallery at all. But at any rate, taking that aside, in Eden, we see in the distance Mount Chocorua, which Cole had sketched in New Hampshire. We see palm trees, which he'd sketched on a trip to the Caribbean, which he took as a young man to St. Eustatius. We see flora, elaborate tropical flora, which he probably saw in the New York Botanical Gardens. Now, the Garden of Eden is a very ambitious picture, but it does still have a certain naive quality to it. And when he tried to sell it to Wadsworth, Wadsworth wasn't interested. What Wadsworth said to him was, you know, if you want to do this kind of thing, you have to travel to Europe. You have to see the old masters. You have to do the grand tour. You have to meet Constable and Turner. You have to engage with a kind of art which will allow you to pull off this kind of work with real grandeur. Of course, Cole had no money. Wadsworth wouldn't pay him. He tried to auction this thing off, and then it didn't work. He tried a raffle. Nobody bought a ticket. It was tragic. 27 years old, with all this aspiration. He knew he needed to get to Europe. And then the director of the New York Botanical Garden bought this painting from him, allowing him the money, along with a loan from a man called Robert Gilmore, to come to England. And this is when we meet William Cullen Bryant, the poet who, at the end of their lives, was shown with Cole on that promontory. And I want to read this sonnet, because this sets up the problem for the rest of our exhibition. Sonnet to an American painter departing for Europe. Of course, he wasn't an American painter, but never mind. Thine eyes shall see the light of distant skies, yet Cole, thy heart shall bear to Europe's strand a living image of thy native land, such as on thy own glorious canvas lies. Lone lakes, savannas where the bison roves, rocks rich with summer garlands, solemn streams, skies where the desert eagle wheels and screams, spring bloom and autumn blaze of boundless groves. Fair scenes shall greet thee where thou goest, fair but different. Everywhere the trace of men, paths, homes, graves, ruins, from the lowest glen to where life shrinks from the fierce alpine air. Gaze on them till the tears shall dim thy sight, but keep that earlier, wilder image bright. It's a wonderful poem, and it's the challenge for Thomas Cole, who sets off for Europe in 1829 with great ambition. He gets to London, so typical, I'm sure you all do this, he gets to London on the last day of the Royal Academy exhibition. It's always the last day. So he runs to Somerset House, and he sees this painting, and it blows his mind. And what we want to do in this exhibition, and with the help of Chris and the National Gallery, the extraordinary thing we could do in New York, is to present the actual paintings that Cole saw that day. The real thing, not a reproduction, not a little label. The actual painting, Ulysses deriding Polyphemus by J.M.W. Turner, hanging at the Royal Academy with the paint still wet in 1829. It's huge. It's ambitious. It's intellectual. It's a subject from Homer. It's bright orange. It's just something Cole had never seen before. And he whips out his little sketchbook and makes this sketch. You see the outline of the sunrise, and he writes all these names of colors. Orange, special orange, yellow. He can't believe that a landscape painting could have all of this. He does another sketch, again, and he puts underneath it, Turner, as if anyone else could ever paint this painting. Then he goes to see Turner. He manages to get an introduction. He goes to the gallery at the back of Turner's house in Queen Anne Street. He meets Turner. This is a lovely little painting, a memory painting of this site by one of Turner's friends. And then he sees this. He sees Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps. Snowstorm. Here's Hannibal on his elephant, reduced to Lilliputian tininess by the enormity of God's creation, with the sun bursting through, punching through. And again, he writes in his notebook, this is an extraordinary work, an effect of chiaroscuro, like he had never seen before, the contrast of light and dark. And this intelligent young man is sucking all this in. However, the conversation with Turner did not go well. Thomas Cole expected Turner to be as genteel as his friends up the Hudson River Valley, prim and proper. And of course, we know from Mike Lee, if we haven't known before, that Turner was nothing of the kind. Cole said he looked like the mate of a shipping vessel. And obviously, they didn't get on. It was very bad. And Cole was absolutely bereft by the idea that that man could have painted these paintings. It just didn't add up for him. But he spent really the rest of his life emulating Turner, thinking about Turner. The other great influence, and that's why it's so wonderful to be standing here and saying these words, the other great influence on Thomas Cole was his very great good luck that the National Gallery had been founded only 5 years before he arrived. The building that we're in now, or next door, had not been built yet. The works were still standing in the house in Pall Mall of Joseph Angerstein, the collector whose collection the National Gallery, the government bought to found the National Gallery and the collection of Sir George Beaumont also together. And Cole was able to see both. And of course, if you've been looking at 9-inch wide aquatint or engraving reproductions of works of Claude all through your self-taught education, the first time you see an actual painting by Claude has a force of revelation with it. The colors, the pearly, he uses the word pearly tones in the distance, the rich coloring of the foliage, and also the compositional blocking. Look at that, the tree on the left, the tree on the right, the water in the middle, the light, dark, your eyes led through the composition. Cole's being taught to become a great artist by looking at work in the National Gallery. That's what the National Gallery was originally for. And that's, I think, what it still does, is to allow artists to come here and study. You can see the mill upstairs in the wonderful room of Claude and Turner upstairs. This painting we were able to take to New York and hang with Thomas Cole in the American wing at the Met, and we're thrilled to have been able to do that. You can see it today in the exhibition at the same time, in the same room or in the same viewpoint as you can see Thomas Cole's work and what he did with it. So essentially our exhibition has three moves. What he did when he went to America first, what he saw when he came back, and then what he did with it. It's a very simple argument, but it's a very different one from the usual argument about Thomas Cole. This is the guidebook to the National Gallery that Thomas Cole had. And he went to see this painting by Rubens, the great Hetch, one of the great founding masterpieces of landscape painting in the European tradition. And this is where Thomas Cole would have got a B+ in my class if he'd been taking it, because he says, a picture in which there is great display of artistic skill without much truth. Well, I don't know about that. I think Rubens is pretty truthful compared to Claude. But obviously, anyway, that's Cole's view for you. But the other place he goes, of course, is where every artist goes to see the new Elgin Marbles, newly installed at the British Museum. He makes this copy of this figure of Ilissos he's basically retrofitting himself. He's tooling up as an artist. He also goes to popular culture events such as the great Panorama, the Panorama in Leicester Square. The building is actually still there. Burford's Panorama, this huge circular painting where you climb up the stairs onto a viewing platform and look at this massive painting that surrounds you on all sides. And that affects his style as well. This is sort of gives you a sense of the workings of a panorama and the size of it. He sends his work to the British institution. Interestingly, when he's here, he chooses to paint American subjects because he wants to be seen to be different from the hundreds of landscape painters who are struggling away here. And his work is exhibited. And one of the works that was exhibited was an 8-foot wide canvas showing Niagara Falls with these extraordinary searing colors, which, of course, American viewers immediately recognize as something you see out of the window in October. But British viewers found very strange and daring. Unfortunately for Cole, however, the hanging committee, or the hangmen as he called them, put his work right up there, skied it in the Royal Academy so that all the fashionable crowd down here in Somerset House just completely ignored it. And he didn't sell anything, and he didn't get a single review, not even Brian Sewell. He got nothing. So his time in London in some ways was miserable, but there was one redeeming feature, which was his friendship with another artist of very different character, and that is John Constable. The other painting that he saw that first day in 1829 at the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition was this, Hadley Castle. It lives at Yale University. I have the pleasure of teaching from it every year, and every week I walk past it. It's a masterpiece of late work by Constable. Constable in his much more troubled and anguished late mode, rather than his early celebration of agricultural life. You can see England has gone to hell, essentially, in this vision of ruin and ruination. This painting stayed with Cole for the rest of his life. He spent many hours replicating it, working through. This is Cole, this is Constable. Working through this L shape, working through the idea of a ruined tower as a sort of emblem of human unhappiness or solitary nature. The other thing we think he learned from John Constable, and he certainly went sketching inside with Constable, sketching from other paintings. He probably went sketching outside, and he probably used this technique, which is so distinctive to Constable, this very expressive technique of oil sketching, and we have some magnificent examples in the exhibition. The sort of thing Cole might have seen. Imagine a 29-year-old student, really, graduate student, if you like, looking at these things for the first time. They're explosive possibilities. Here is Thomas Cole, sketching in Italy, using that technique, pushing paint around, catching the fugitive moment of cloudburst over the Roman Campagna. There are also other sources for this kind of painting. It may not be one-to-one from Constable, but certainly is what Constable was doing. And I love the way that you can see the sort of chewed-up edge of this working object. Not a finished painting, it's a sketch, private sketch. And this is another sketch that Cole did. I've got him now to Italy because finally he managed to get together enough money to go into stage 2 of his grand tour, which was to go, using his newfound expertise from London, to go to Italy to look at the landscapes that Claude Lorraine had painted, the perfect landscapes of the Roman Campagna. He even rented an apartment that somebody told him was Claude's apartment. Now, never believe a real estate person if they tell you this is Claude's apartment. But anyway, Cole thought he was living in Claude's studio, and he went to see Claude's subjects, but he used a kind of Constable-esque. I mean, look at the energy of this sketch, this little oil sketch. You can see it in the show. Let's go closer. The sheer bravura and power of what this young man is now doing. He's painting these ruins. And then he comes up with this great finished painting, a 6-footer, a grand exhibition picture. And this, I think, is where we see the mature Thomas Cole coming through. Because he certainly has compressed some of this, the topography. It's not an exact transcription of the Roman Campagna with the great aqueduct here. But Cole is always thinking about history. He's always thinking about the before and the after. He's thinking about the Garden of Eden and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, about the rise and fall of civilizations. That's why he finds this so poignant. And I can't help thinking that the reason he picked this topic was because the previous year in London, and particularly look at that extraordinary piece of this painting of the Roman aqueduct, he had seen the announcement of the first, and the invention of the word viaduct, which was invented to describe the bridges that were built for the new Liverpool and Manchester Railway, and these prints were made in 1830-31 as Cole was in London. Look at the before and after. This is then, this is the Romans, this is us, this is now. He wanted to be able to do a kind of historical painting that involved figures. Now, we all know that Turner had his difficulties with figures, and Thomas Cole put himself through the Florence Academy. He actually went through a course of rigorous training, rather effectively. This is quite a good life study that he created. So you can see it in the exhibition. And he loved Florence. He loved Florence because of its sense of history. He made this panoramic sketch, remembering those panorama paintings with their great long horizons like this. And he created, once he got back to New York, this wonderful, technically accomplished bravura picture of Florence with, and I think this is really charming, a self-portrait of himself as a dreamy youth in the very same place that he appears in the Oxbow just a few years later than he was in Florence. But on his return to New York, Cole had a much bigger plan. And it's very intriguing to look in his notebooks and to see that he had made a note the day he went to Turner's studio in December 1829, dark, foggy London December. And that note says, "I will paint a series of paintings charting the rise and fall of a great empire." And there will be, he already knew there will be 5 pictures. There will be 5 pictures, and they will be the savage state, the beginning of the history of this empire. The pastoral state, it reaches a sort of tranquil moment of agricultural and civilization. Civilization is born. Consummation of empire, a great city filled with riches and luxury, but also tending to decadence. Destruction. The internal problems of running an empire eventually overrun it. There's a sort of civil war going on, terrible catastrophe, and finally, desolation. All of this he thinks of on the day he saw Turner. Now, did he think of it in the morning and see Turner in the afternoon, or was it the other way around? We will never know. They're both on the same page. But it does seem to me that this was his great work. This was his equivalent of Turner's rise and fall of the Carthaginian Empire. Turner's idea that landscape painting can tell the big, grand historical narratives. The problem for Cole, getting back to America in 1833, was, that he was once again broke. Not only that, his father was also broke, as usual. So Thomas had a tremendous challenge. He was having to turn out sort of pot boilers to keep the family going. And then he met this man, Lumen Reed, who was a retired New York grocer, a man who'd made a fortune in retail, who was just bought a new house in downtown Manhattan and said to Cole, you know, I will let you do whatever you want because you're a genius. This is not the kind of patronizing advice he'd received from the earlier patrons. This now is a man who believes in Cole. Paid him $3,000 to execute this great cycle. The only condition was it had to fit round his fireplace. And so that's why for many, many years these works, The Course of Empire, have hung in this arrangement at the New York Historical Society because it was believed that this is the proper way to do it. We have hung them completely differently as a panorama so that you can see them all at once. And we believe that Cole, I mean, obviously he had to do what his patron said, but if the fireplace hadn't been there, we think he would have done it our way. You can make your own judgment about that. But let me just take you through this, because this is one of the most extraordinary works of 19th century art, I think, in any country. Its ambition and its range and its sort of affective difference between the different styles of each painting are quite astounding. The title comes from Bishop Berkeley, the Bishop of Cloyne, who imagined the Americas finally providing the best of all human history. After Tyre and Egypt and Greece and Europe had risen and fallen, the Americas would finally be the solution. Westward, the course of empire takes its way. The first 4 acts, so that's the Romans, the Greeks, the Europeans, already past. A 5th, America, shall close the drama with the day. Time's noblest offspring is the last. So even the title compares the American project with the earlier European projects, and so we'll bear that in mind. So we start with the savage state. Now, if you'd gone to the Royal Academy in the 1830s, you'd probably seen quite a few pictures like this. Pictures were coming back, for example, from John Glover in Australia of Aboriginal life. There were pictures of various parts of the British Empire where indigenous cultures were being sort of primitivized. The interesting thing about this is it does definitely refer to Native American life. There are teepees, there are canoes here, but this character here is anything but a person of color. This is actually a Caucasian figure. This is us. This is the ancestors of the people standing in the Royal Academy, the wealthy middle class looking at this, or the people standing in the National Academy of Design or in New York in 1836. In other words, this is where we started. And it's all about us, not about them. So it's a very different kind of painting from a colonial British painting of other people. In fact, so European is this figure. It's based on this great Roman copy of a Greek sculpture that Cole saw in the Louvre in Paris, the Borghese Gladiator. I'm sure you can see that he's using that, deliberately using that classical figure. So we're sort of looking at our own history as Europeans or Euro-Americans. And here in the second of the cycle, we have the Pastoral State. Now here is the Mill, the painting he saw in the National Gallery. It's upstairs now. And here is his response to it. The Claudian composition, the water in the middle. And he shows us a sort of ideal state of civilization. So mathematics has just been invented. Luckily, Pythagoras happened to be standing right there at the moment he was painting. We have dance suddenly emerging from the peasant life of the simple figures of the landscape. Music has been invented, and very charmingly, art is invented in this stick figure here. I think you can see that. Underneath it, TC, Thomas Cole. In other words, I am inventing American art at this moment and with this picture. So in many ways, this is the world that Cole admires. It's interesting that Christianity is nowhere to be seen, but we do have a kind of religious observance, and this is one of the very few references to an actual structure. He gives us Stonehenge as a sort of origin of architecture, origin of religion or ritual. And that was a building that John Constable was fascinated by and had also drawn and painted. But there is one note of dissonance in this otherwise balanced and tranquil picture, and that's right here. And it's interesting that it's there because that leads on to the next historical stage. And that is the chopping down of trees. Cole believed that trees were sacred objects, were almost like human beings, and that to destroy a tree is a terrible thing. This was considered rather ridiculous in the 1830s when the whole of the Hudson Valley was being logged and that, you know, trees were being chopped down to burn for industrial purposes or for tanning. Money, trees were money, so of course you chop them down. But Cole took a view which we can now recognize as much more sensible. He understood the ecological value as well as the beauty of trees. So the violence of, look at the violence of that chopping, is a warning that when we get to the next canvas, things probably have already gone too far. But this isn't the eye of the beholder. I asked you, is this a beautiful city, a gorgeous place with fantastic real estate? Or is this a symbol of decadence and degeneracy in the polis? Is all this gold magnificent or vulgar? I'm not going to mention Trump Tower at this moment, not at all, because I'm on live and I've got to get my visa to go back into the country. But look at the excess of population. Let's look at some details. Look at the way that the landscape has been built. Sorry, I should have pointed out to you that in the previous pictures, this is a crucial point, you notice this beautiful rock on top of a hill, and then if we go right back to the Savage State, there it is again. So we're in the same place, but we're moving through time. But the beautiful mountain has been turned into a kind of suburban nightmare of roads and overbuilding here. So things have gone terribly wrong, I think, according to Thomas Cole. He shows us that there is great learning. There's a statue of Minerva. They're very much like the ones that were being put up. This is one in Vienna from the 19th century. There's an emperor. And Cole had actually been in London when George IV's funeral took place. So he knew about imperial processions. The emperor has been stealing other people's works of art. So that might be a reference to Napoleon, bringing all the art of Italy to the Musée Napoleon only 15, 20 years earlier. Look at the population, out of control, too many people everywhere. And the philosophers, it's really rather like the United States now. The intellectuals are seriously worried, but nobody's listening to them. There are people looking at scrolls and thinking this is really bad news. You know, I mean, he doesn't like the idea of Brexit either, this guy. But anyway, there we are. It's not looking good for the future, according to the intellectuals. And for once, they have a point. Now, what is he referring to? Of course, it's a reference to Rome. He's been to Rome. But he thought of this when he was in England. He thought of it when he was in the greatest city on earth at the heart of the largest empire. And this is a point that's completely absent from Cole's scholarship, but really it took a Brit, I suppose, to realize from walking through Regent's Park that this architecture is just what John Nash had been building, 1826, 1836. Cole saw it in 1829, the Cumberland Terrace, Regent's Park. So he's referring to Rome, but he's also referring to London. And that's why we include Constable's great painting, Waterloo Bridge, the opening of Waterloo Bridge. The event took place in 1817, but the picture's from 1832. It's in the show because it's a great imperial celebration of a victory over Napoleon with a bridge in the foreground. Look at that. There it is. And if we go closer, we see Constable putting the Royal Academy at the center of this, but also showing us the filth. Go close to this painting downstairs if you can and look at the filth of the factory chimneys, the shot towers of the South Bank, with Constable Snow, this white painting all over the top of it. So the emperor, of course, then could be George IV. He's dressed in red. And there is actually an imperial dimension. There's this Indian elephant pulling the chariot with the emperor on it. There are enslaved Africans here. Very interesting question for the United States, which still had slavery. There's a comparison for the Indian elephants for the East India Company, British Empire. And here's a comparison for the enslaved. Britain, after all, passed the legislation in 1833 to free the slaves across the entire British Empire. 1834 it came into effect, and in 1836 Cole paints this picture. So it's hot news, slavery, at this time. So here it is, the great imperial jamboree of this painting, and inevitably what happens next. I have to say, one of the most moving and shocking teaching experiences I've ever had was to be teaching this painting in the class at Yale on September the 11th. 2001, and to see the horror of what looked like very similar pictures coming through the television in New Haven from New York City just down the road, and to think of what happens when violence afflicts a great capital. And I think Thomas Cole was thinking back to, of course, you know, the French Revolution, all sorts of recent events. He uses once again the same Borghese gladiator. And now we look and see that so does the person who did the caricature of the Luddite. And I do think there is a connection here. Look at those burning buildings and look at the burning of buildings in Cole's childhood. I think the violence of his childhood is actually seen here, as if industrialization and modernity is actually the engine that in the end will create this kind of disaster and catastrophe. But of course, the other thing is he's remembering Turner's studio and that great vortex of cloud, which he replicates, but in an intelligent and creative way, he uses to dramatize the terrible effects of destruction of empire. And then finally, we find ourselves at the end, desolation. All is lost, no human presence is left. And Cole just gives us a hint that nature is taking over again, that the birds and the animals have returned from the, you know, their sort of banishment under this great empire. Intriguingly, this is the painting which I think, look at the sketchiness of it, look at the fluidity of the brushwork. This is the one which is closest to John Constable. And of course, he's repainting that L-shaped picture of ruination, Hadley Castle, which you can see. I hope when you're in our show, you'll look at the British paintings and then swivel, because you can actually see the course of empire at the same time as the British pictures. If I wanted to paint an X on the floor so that you get the right spot, but you'll see how this conversation is actually found. Now, this set up a kind of tradition of viewing ruined cities. Gustave Doré shows us a New Zealander looking at the ruins of London, 1871. And I'm sure everyone in the room has seen Planet of the Apes, right? Which is the same idea, the idea of viewing a ruined city in the future. This is a sort of trope in American popular culture. So there it is, the course of empire. This is the absolute center of our exhibition, the climax of it in many ways. So I want to conclude by taking you back to the Oxbow, where we started. And it may seem as if these are two totally separate projects. One, a modern landscape prospect of a real place in America, the other a completely fictional allegorical cycle. But we knew that he painted them at exactly the same time, because there's a wonderful letter to Lumen Reed saying, I am not going to get the consummation of empire finished for the exhibition in the summer of 1836. Can I please take 6 weeks off to knock out something I can sell for the show? Lumen Reed says, fine. He's the patron from heaven. He's the perfect man. And Cole happened to have a canvas exactly the same size as the biggest of the five, right there. So he stops painting this and he starts painting this. And he uses a sketch, which you can see in the exhibition, from his panoramic sketchbook of the river, Massachusetts River, the Connecticut River in Northampton, Massachusetts here. He makes a beautiful, beautiful little oil sketch in the studio, using the style that Constable, I think, had taught him. And then he sets to work. And this is where it gets interesting, because the Met has just bought a new, extremely sensitive infrared, X-ray reflectography machine, which allows you to see drawing underneath the surface of a painting, but in much greater clarity than ever before. So we had these two pictures examined in this way at the Met. And there they are on the easels. And we suddenly started to see something uncanny, which was when we X-rayed the Oxbow, we suddenly started to see lines emerging from underneath. And they are not lines of anything that could ever be in this rural landscape. In fact, I don't know if you can make them out, but there's a face there. There are lines and pillars. And it turns out to be the exact same spot in this painting that is underneath this painting. Now, how do you explain that? Well, the answer is we found some documentary evidence that Cole had actually started to do Consummation of Empire, the horrible, big, vulgar city, and he'd given up on the drawing because he felt he got it wrong, so he started again on another canvas. So he used that first abandoned canvas to paint the Oxbow. But imagine what it means for looking at the Oxbow if underneath this canvas are these lines that start to look like railway lines or like modern industry emerging from underneath the countryside. So looking at Thomas Cole, he's looking at us, he's actually looking at you, I think, over there. Yes, he's looking right this way. I came to at least the interpretation, I think my colleague Betsy Kornhauser would agree, that this painting is a question for us. And then you start to look at it. Are you seeing it? Yeah, a question mark. And it may be so unsubtle that sophisticated people won't be able to handle it, but I think Thomas Cole is saying, you, or you. He's looking at us, look at that. And he's asking us, how much further are you going to let this go? The wilderness, the glories of the American continent, untouched by human hand, have been replaced largely by what's already starting to look sickeningly like the clearance of the forests. And the question is, are you going to let it go on? He places another symbol here, which is up here. It looks like the clearance of the forests, and that's what it is. But I don't know if anyone has good Hebrew, but I'm told that if you read it this way, it stands for, if you pronounce it out loud, it says Noah. Noah, of course, the flood is coming, you will be punished for your sins, you will destroy the world you live in. And I think that is the moral of this story, that underneath this is the inevitable cycle that will lead you to this. So Thomas Cole's painting, which we thought of as a rather happy meditation on American progress, turns out to be a deeply concerned, in fact, a Cassandra-like warning about the dangers of unrestrained expansion. Now, when Cole returned, the president, Andrew Jackson, had lifted a lot of restrictions on the expansion of industrialization and agriculture in the United States, and he had embarked on a policy of removing native people brutally and relocating them into the West, the March of Tears, it's known as in Native American culture. So terrible things were happening, which of course were also glorious things if you happen to be investing in some of those businesses. But Cole is warning us, I think, and it's a warning that seems more powerful in 2018 than at any moment since. So I leave you with Thomas Cole, the boy from Bolton, who observed the landscape of his youth in this terrible throes of this terrible transformation and ecological disaster, warning America not to go the same way, and creating in that warning a work of such poignancy and such immediacy that I think it reaches right out to speak to us today. Thank you.